Welcome back to Dialogue Not Division. In this fourth episode, we will be discussing what I've been teasing for a couple episodes, gun control. I figured this would be coming with the left having control of the House and the Senate. We're already seeing some gun control bills getting filed, so in this episode, I wanted to discuss gun control in the most fair way possible I possibly could, and then I'm going to discuss what I think is one of the worst gun control bills for quite a few reasons. Again, I'm not saying that to try to divide anybody. I think that both sides can really agree why this bill is not great, and I'm going to walk you through how I think it might be well intentioned but off base. So, starting with the controversy that we're going to talk about today, I was browsing Facebook as I often do. And one of the things I saw was Alaska's Governor Mike Dunleavy, I believe is how you say it. He posted something on Facebook saying, "In Alaska, we cherish the Second Amendment and our individual right to keep and bear arms. Politicians in D.C. are at it again with schemes to take away your ability to defend yourself. As your governor, I promise that Alaska will remain a safe space for the Second Amendment." So here, unsurprisingly, he's a conservative governor. And what you saw in the comments was a bunch of people flaming him for being controversial or try to stir up controversy. One of my favorite comments that I think really just sums this up is it said, "In case you haven't learned this, no one is going to take your guns away. That has never been the case, ever. You're only doing this to rile up your base." So that was one of the comments. There were quite a few other comments along those lines. So what I wanted to do here is really take a moment and just start with the facts and look at both sides, and then we'll get into whether or not I think he was really trying to stir up the base. One thing I do want to apologize if you hear me kind of breathing heavy or if I take lots of breaks or I sound funny. I am getting over a sickness today. So just bear with me, and I would appreciate it. Before I get into this, I do want to acknowledge my biases, and I am very pro-gun. I do own weapons, but what I want to do is to really try to boil this down to the facts and trying to understand both sides and where both sides are coming from this. There are some areas of the gun control topic I'm definitely not going to get into. I'm going to go pretty heavy onto both sides. If you're pro Second Amendment, I'd encourage you to stick around and just listen to some of the stats that I cite. I did a lot of research, and as me being a pro-gun person, there was a lot of interesting facts that I came up with. And I'd encourage you, just because you hear some facts that may not agree with what you think, for you to just hang in there. We'll get a little bit more to your side of the point of the argument here in a moment. And what I really want to do is for both sides to just take a moment and consider some of the facts and what both sides believe and go from there. And then we'll take a look at, again, what I say is I think one of the worst gun control bills I've seen in a very long time. So I'm going to go ahead and go with starting to explain the problem that we're trying to fix here. So most of these stats I'm trying to pull from the CDC or fairly reputable research, pulled right from the CDC for gun violence in 2019. There were 39,707 gun-related deaths in the United States for 2019. So that sounds like an awful lot. And what I wanted to do is dig into some of those numbers. Of those, 14,414 were homicides or murders with firearms, and then 23,941 were suicides with a firearm. And that's one of the things I wanted to point out a lot when you're talking about gun violence is most of the time they lump in suicides or people self-inflicting harm along with homicides and other violent crime to inflate the numbers. Overall, they are gun issues, but they're really not the same thing. And I don't like that more often than not, one side really lumps in all of those numbers. When you're talking about gun violence these days, you can't not talk about mass shootings, so we will talk about that a little bit. The average, or not the average, there were about 211 deaths in mass shootings in 2019. We'll get into why I had to say about in a little bit, but long story short is there isn't a single definition for a mass shooting, and depending on whose definition you go by, it might just be anything where two people were, it might be four people died. Some people use such broad mass shooting definitions where nobody even has to die for it to be counted as a mass shooting, but that's about the number that I found. 211 of those 14,414 homicides were with firearms. And interestingly, um, of those 39,700 some odd deaths, 3,700 of them were children, or that's an average of it per year. I couldn't find the exact statistics for 2019, so you will notice that it affects quite a few children. So to compare those numbers, so again, we're just under 40,000 gun-related deaths, about 14,500 homicides with firearms. I want to compare that to some of the other forms of death. The top killer in the United States for 2019, as almost always, is heart disease. That's about 660,000 Americans. 173,000 people died from accidents. About 87,500 people died from diabetes. And there were a total of 4,511 suicides in 2019. Let's see, with that, and one thing to note is suicides are the 10th leading cause of death. You'll notice that with 23,941 of those coming from firearms, that over half of the suicides, or right about half of the suicides, are with firearms. Comparing that again to other things, other common things, drug overdoses, there were 70,000, a little bit over. Vehicle deaths are right at about 38,800 vehicle deaths, so that's kind of right along the lines of the total gun deaths. About 40,000 unintentional fall deaths. And an interesting stat I found is it's estimated that there are 251,000 lives are claimed every year because of medical error by doctors. None of those are direct comparisons. The big difference here, and sometimes you'll see other sides say, oh, this isn't as big of a problem. Most of these things you're talking about, heart disease, there's no ill intention there. It's just something that happens. So you can't really compare exactly these to each other. Gun violence certainly is something that is avoidable or shouldn't happen, whereas most vehicle deaths are accidental. And again, so I don't want to directly compare them to, but I did want to give some scope to where those 40,000 under 40,000 gun-related deaths, where it kind of falls in that. And again, only less than 15,000 of those are homicides or murders. The vast majority of those are suicides with firearms. So my conclusion from all of this is firearm murders are nowhere near the top 10. I'm not even sure as well if those 14,414 homicides include the 726 justifiable homicides that are committed by police or civilians. The CDC didn't really have a good definition for that. So those justifiable homicides, if you kill somebody in self-defense, that's considered, it's still homicide, it's just considered a justifiable homicide if it was a legal case of self-defense. So again, I'm not sure if those factor in there or not. Another conclusion I have from those stats is mass shootings are scary. They really leave a dent on society, but they really don't compare with other risks. For instance, more people died in plane crashes than died in mass shootings. Those just are really impactful events that are terrible, that happen all at once, that really are used to kind of shape the conversation around gun violence. But I did want to put that into perspective with that is a very small portion of gun deaths, and it's a very small portion of the deaths overall in the US. However, by no means are they acceptable, and that is something that we want to look and find ways of avoiding, and we'll talk about that. And then the other conclusion I really want you to get is by far the largest gun issue, one side will argue about this, other won't, is the suicides by firearm. Because we're talking about 24,000 people dying by suicide with firearm, and we'll go into that in a little bit. Another thing to note is that gun issues do often target children. Children are at a significant risk. Most of those, again, are suicides for children, and of course, some are involved in mass shootings. So that's another thing that I wanted to talk about. Rolling right into mass shootings, because you can't have a conversation about gun control without talking about mass shootings. During all the research I did, everything's showing that mass shootings are increasing. There are a lot of different theories for why the mass shootings are increasing. Some people blame the mental health crisis in the United States. We'll talk about that in a little bit further on. Some people blame the prevalence of guns. Some people blame the media's glorification of the mass shooters, spreading their names everywhere. It's pretty clear from the stats that I saw most mass shooters are suicidal. They normally go in, and a lot of times they will shoot themselves. Another thing that's really hard that I talked about before when talking about mass shooting is they're not clearly defined. So if you do your own research, I would be skeptical on finding these articles that talk about there are more mass shootings in the year than there are days, things like that. If it doesn't seem to make sense, I would encourage you to really look into the definition or how they're defining mass shooters. For instance, if there's a gang drive-by and they shoot a couple people and nobody dies, some people put that as a mass shooting, others don't. The more traditional definition, I would say, of mass shootings, or what people think when there's mass shootings, is more of the things like the school shootings, when some unhinged person takes a gun and goes out and shoot people, normally for no reason and mostly randomly. If you look at that as the definition, the number's going to be a lot smaller. One of the things that you'll sometimes hear conservatives argue about is that, well, those mass shooters all got their guns illegally. One thing to note is the studies I've looked at, depending on the study, again, it's really hard to define or look at a lot of this because the mass shootings, they all have different numbers. Say at least 3/4 of them did get their gun legally. So that's an interesting note, and that's where I think a lot of people start calling for more gun control and stricter background checks, things like that. I will note though that 3/4 number, I don't necessarily agree with that. I saw another number that said 6% when I was looking at it. And again, I don't know if I agree with that because I looked at a lot of the underlying cases. And when you do purchase a gun legally from any dealer, every state or federal law requires there to be a background check from any dealer, or some states don't require it on private sales. So it'd be like you selling your couch on Craigslist. Some states would allow you to sell a firearm like that. But what I found a lot of times is you fill out this form and they do a background check. A lot of these people lied on that background check form, which in and of itself is a crime. And I believe it's actually a felony. So to me, if you lie on that form and commit a felony, excuse me, like I said, I'm kind of recovering from a sickness here. But if you lie and commit a felony on that form when applying for it, I don't consider you getting that gun legally. For instance, another one, and this is another one where it wouldn't be legal, one of the mass shooters was dishonorably discharged from the military, which a dishonorable discharge normally disqualifies you for a gun. That is one of the questions on the background check form. If he had checked that, he would not have got a weapon. So they still gave it to him anyway because those records didn't make it to the background check system, so it didn't show up. In my case, I still consider that an illegal purchase, whereas it seemed like they were listing that as he bought it legally because the background check didn't discover that he lied and committed that what I believe is a felony by lying on that form. So that's one of the things. So I don't really count where law enforcement failed to do their job, or the records weren't complete, or the system didn't work as appropriate as buying it legally. To me, that indicates a fault in the system that needs to be corrected. So we need to enforce the laws that we have. But I'm going to move on past that. Another thing to note when it comes to mass shooting is many mass shooters displayed warning signs. Quite a few of them were investigated. And a lot of them, the FBI either failed to follow up or they didn't. They felt like they didn't have anything actionable on that. Another thing to note, an interesting fact, is that the Journal of Criminology and Public Policy did a research on all the mass shooters between 1976 to 2018 and found that 61% of them had either been diagnosed with a mental disorder or demonstrated signs of serious mental illness prior to the attack. So that's an interesting thing. Also, people that have been committed or have serious mental illnesses are not supposed to be able to purchase or own firearms under the current system. Another interesting fact that'll come into a little bit more relevant today is 1 in 4 Americans suffer from a diagnosable mental illness in each year, according to Johns Hopkins Medicine. So the vast majority of Americans suffer from some kind of mental illness at some point in the year. I shouldn't say the vast majority, 1 in 4. Depending on the study you look at, you'll see different numbers there. But that was an interesting factor that I think really comes into play as we get further into this gun control setting. So with that, if you're committed involuntarily to any kind of mental facility, or you're deemed mentally defective by a court, it disqualifies you from having a gun. However, institutionalization so that committing involuntarily for mental health is at an all-time low. If you go and you look, society has really put a focus on what they call deinstitutionalization, or not forcing people with mental illnesses into any kind of hospitalization or anything like that unless they really absolutely have to. There's a real lack, if you look into the data, of mental health facilities. It's actually a lot harder to get mental health care than it should be. So really what you're seeing in this, or what I'm seeing from that, is if you are committed involuntarily, it disqualifies you from owning the gun, but we're not doing that anymore. And for good reasons, but we're not doing that anymore, so that kind of caveat doesn't come into effect very much at all. And another thing to mention as we discuss these things is mass shootings are terrible, but many people will argue that you have other things like mass stabbings. And I understand that it's a lot harder to pull off a mass stabbing, I should say. You do see these in other countries, they have lower gun ownership rates, such as the United Kingdom. There are cases where up to 19, 20 people are killed by mass stabbings. So this goes in as they talk about mass shootings take away the guns and they won't happen. There's an argument there where you talk about perhaps there be a substitution and people would just run around doing mass stabbings. Another thing you're seeing a lot is people throwing acid in people's faces now. There are a lot of ways that bad people can hurt other people. And the argument there is that it's a lot more convenient for people to grab a gun, especially when they're so available. Really, my conclusion for this is mental health really does play a role in many of these cases of the mass shootings. As we saw, the 61% of those. Signs of aggression really should be attended to and reports followed up and investigated. Again, many of these mass shooters, there was some kind of warning that they might have acted the way they did. Another takeaway from this is the current system often fails. There are background checks in place. Contrary to popular belief or popular understanding, at gun shows, you do actually have to do a background check, unless it's a private sale. With that, but oftentimes the system fails. Oftentimes those records or the different things that would disqualify you from owning a gun just don't make it into the database. There's a lot that doesn't happen there. And another thing when talking about mass shooting is I do want people to remember that the risk isn't actually that high comparative to just about every other source of death. This year, more people died in airline crashes, way more died last year than actual murders. Even deaths by blunt objects beat the number of mass shooting victims. So really what I'm saying is what we do is we take a lot of fear of this happening and we trade security for our freedom. So the freedom to own weapons or certain types of weapons, we take this relatively, I hate to say it, but relatively minor when compared to all of the other causes of death. all of the other violent crime. We take this and we really react to it because it's it's so terrible and it just feels terrible, and we oftentimes use this to really inform public policy on guns, use this to try to control them or enact rules that may or may not even affect the outcome of the gun. So really what I'm kind of arguing here is I don't think mass shooting should play as big of a role in the gun control conversation as it does. And you might disagree with that because, again, they are very bad things. But I would argue that the much bigger problem is here we have a lot more. We can look at the overall homicide rates, which is much, much higher at 14,500, give or take. Or we can look at the overall numbers of firearm-related deaths at nearly 40,000, and it just far dwarfs the low 200s that died from mass shootings. So I would just encourage people not to really use this to inform a lot of the policy. And that's what I wanted to say on mass shootings, just to kind of frame that in. And moving on, what I do think is a significant problem in the US, it is one of the top 10 killers in the US is suicides. And as I mentioned before, most firearm deaths are suicides by a lot. And the majority of successful suicides are with a firearm. And what you see is here is people are very much blaming the weapon that people are using to commit this suicide. And there are two sides to this. One of the terrible things is that suicide is a leading cause of death for kids and young adults. And a lot of those suicides are by firearms. There is a lot of research when I was doing research that shows access to guns does affect the suicide rate. However, most of these studies are showing that the largest difference in this is the survival rate. So when you talk about this, one of the Harvard studies did most suicides are momentary impulses of despair, and 90% of the individuals do not go through with it once their feelings ease. Whether attempters live or die depends large part on the ready availability of highly lethal means, especially firearms. So what they're saying here is most suicides, it's a very fleeting thing, but the people that have that extremely lethal form to try to commit it are way more often successful. The stats I found from them was for a firearm, it's 90% successful. People don't normally survive a suicide attempt by a firearm, whereas suicide by drowning is only 56% successful, hanging is only about 53%, and any method, they have an 8.5% method. So what you see here is the firearm is very, very lethal when it comes to suicide. And really that's the largest difference in why firearms are causing, or why firearms have so many suicides associated with them when the rest of the suicides are caused by small other things. Because really what we're doing is we're not comparing attempted suicides by all of the means. We're only comparing successful suicides, and the firearm is by far the most successful. What I have found is most experts agree that if access is taken away, many people will substitute. The rate of substitution for other weapons, it's not clear, and I was able to find quite a few studies that showed a pretty good correlation between not having access to a firearm and lowering suicide rates. So there's an interesting argument there, or a good argument there, that people that are suicidal, them not having easy access to a firearm is a good thing and will help prevent them from trying to use one of those more deadly means, or in this case the firearm means. Another stat I found is most people who commit suicide have a diagnosable mental disorder. Again, if you're committed because of a mental disorder, you're not allowed to own a firearm. However, it could be that you were never committed. It could be that you had it prior to this and it wasn't taken away. It could be, there's many things. It could be another member of the family that owns the firearm, as you see often with teens. A lot of times teens will get a hold of a parent's firearm, and that's how they commit suicide. So you see here that it's very it's it there's a lot of evidence there that point towards the fact that reducing firearm access would reduce suicide success. One RAND study I found that with regard to background checks and safe storage laws, they found moderate evidence that they do reduce firearm suicides, and they found limited evidence that they reduce overall suicides. So they did find some evidence that they reduce firearm suicides, and some evidence that they reduce the overall rate of suicides. You will see that on a lot of the charts if you look at the suicide by firearm rate in all of the different states. You will definitely see the states where there's less access to firearms or fewer people have firearms, there are fewer firearm deaths, which makes sense. If nobody has firearms, they're probably not going to be selecting the firearm that they don't have to commit suicide or violence. So one thing that I wanted to point here, and this really goes into where perhaps this bill that I'm going to talk about was good intentioned. Mental health does play a factor in suicides. Firearm isn't the cause of the suicides, it's just an extremely effective tool. Reducing access for suicidal people could, or has some evidence that it will reduce overall suicide, and kids should be kept away with guns, or kept away from guns. So with all of that, I'm talking about all of these deaths that are a result of firearms, and right now, the gun control people are like, yes, he's talking about this, maybe breaking it down, defending something, but he's talking about it. These are all of the bad things that happen with firearms, and we're focusing mostly on deaths. There are other things that happen, armed robberies do happen, things like that happen as well. But the other side's going, well, surely there must be benefits to the firearm. So, of course, I looked into that. There are a lot of interesting facts quoted by the pro-gun side. Some of them are a little shakier than others. So, as I mentioned before, the CDC sites state there were 726 justifiable homicides, 386 of them by private citizens. So, in this case, in the year, last year, it's actually not last year anymore. In 2019, there were 386 private citizens that committed a justifiable homicide. So in this case, someone was committing a felony against them or somebody else, and they used it to defend themselves. 386 was what they had as the justifiable homicides. So in this case, it was reported to the police, all of that, which seems a little bit low. So again, you go and you look for other data, and what you find is when it comes to the benefits of firearms, two things. Both, there's not a ton of research. A lot of the research done, it's hard to be reliable and it's heavily critiqued because it's very easy to cite how many people died. That data is readily available. When you go and how many times was a firearm used in defense of yourself, that's not always reported. And oftentimes it won't be reported. Many of the states aren't required to submit that information, whether or not there's just a lot of factors in there. So really all you have is either the FBI or the CDC goes through all of the cases that were submitted federally, and they go and try to look at those, which again, we get that about 386 number for 2019. Or what you do is you survey individuals and you ask them. So when the Foundation for Economic Education surveyed, that's a different one. So there was one study that was done. This one was done for the CDC by another group. They estimated that there were between 60,000 to 2.5 million defensive gun uses each year. So that's the number that you'll hear a lot. Again, that's done by surveying individuals. So that number is shaky, and you can't point at the exact number, but that's very significant. Between 60,000 to 2.5 million defensive gun uses. Looking at that, also they found there was another study done for the CDC, another national survey. They found that the surveys indicate that defensive gun uses by victims are at least as common as offensive uses by criminals, with estimates of annual uses ranging from about 500,000 to more than 3. So here you see another number, this one much, much larger, with the estimate of 500,000. Another study I found had the defensive gun uses at just over 1 million, for where they were used for self-protection or for the protection of home, work, or elsewhere, excluding military service, police work, or work as a security guard. This one very specifically said it yielded an estimate of 162,000 cases per year where somebody almost certainly would have been killed if they had not used a gun for protection. So if you trust that source, and again, it's very hard to estimate, that one quite clearly has 162,000 cases where somebody might have died if it had not been for a fire. So again, these are all by surveys. These are by studies off of data. A lot of people quite easily cast doubt on them because, again, they're not that reliable. What I was able to find, though, the Justice Department has actual figures, and they had 235,700 defensive uses of a firearm in the five-year period between 2007 and 2011. So just to get that straight, that's 47,000. That's over 40,000 defensive uses to prevent a crime each year. So here what we're talking about is there were 40,000 deaths. Here we're seeing over 40,000 defensive uses to prevent a crime. Here they're talking about serious crimes such as normally violent crimes. So what I want to get here is the conclusion I want you to have is guns almost certainly provide some type of positive effect for many people, and I just want people to realize that it's perfectly reasonable to believe this positive far outweighs the negative. So if you are looking at a lot of these studies and the surveys, you are seeing that at a minimum, there were the 47,140 defensive uses per year, and oftentimes some of these studies are going up to 500,000 to more than 3 million. I would not argue for the 3 million factor. So really, there is pretty good evidence that there are some benefits. And if you are anti-gun, I would just recommend that you at least consider that. They are for self-defense. A lot of people have them for self-defense. What you'll hear from one side is saying, well, less than 1% of cases or of violent crimes were prevented by the use of a firearm. If you hear that stat, what I want you to know is that less than 1% came directly from this study. That less than 1% is the 235,700 defensive uses between 2007 and 2011. So yeah, it might be less than 1%, but that's still 47,000 people per year that potentially were saved from a violent crime. So, some food for thought. Now that we've talked a little bit about the problem and maybe some of the both sides, I want to talk about House Bill 127 that was submitted by a Democrat from Texas, of all states. So, on its face, here's what it's asking for: mandatory firearm registration, mandatory mental health screenings. And I think if you've been listening by now, you can at least understand where that's coming from. Mental health, as we talked about it, that's an issue for both suicide. Ideally, they're trying to drive down those suicide rates. They're trying to drive down the mass shooting rates, as we found, or as we said, 61% of them were found to have issues. Mandatory training. And even pro-gun people often say, yes, we want people to have more training. It's important to have training. It's important to know your firearm. It's important to know how to be safe. So I think by that, a lot of people would agree with that, although mandatory training, we'll talk about why that might be a bad thing. Another thing is mandatory liability insurance. So I believe the intention with this one is if something happens through negligence, you have insurance. That way the injured party can come and sue, or their family. So I understand where that's coming from. There's also additional mental health screenings for what they call military-style weapons. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But there's no arguing that most of those military-style weapons, they have been used in a lot of the high-profile mass shootings. So they're probably trying to go there to minimize them. However, I do want to point out that over 60, I think it's about 61% of homicides are committed by handguns. If you look at the vast majority of all of the killings, they're actually committed by handguns and not normally by rifles. I believe the stats I saw, the military style weapons only accounted for 4% of gun deaths. So it's an interesting fact there. There's also a notification of transfer requirement. So if you let somebody else use the weapon, you have to notify them. Again, trying to get rid of a child steals a weapon from somebody, or you loan it to somebody who goes and does something bad with it. That's the intention, I believe. Publicly available registry of weapons. I'm not sure what the intention is here. I have a hard time finding a good intention there for making it publicly available. I understand that they want a registry of weapons and they want that available to law enforcement. Mandatory safe storage is on there, which, as we talked about, suicides are one of the top leading causes of death for youth. A lot of those suicides are by firearm. Firearms are very successful when committing suicide, or I don't think successful is the right word, but unfortunately they are effective when it comes to attempting suicide. So safe storage is absolutely understandable to put in there, is not wanting children or other people to be able to get access to that weapon. Another interesting one is the banning of 50 caliber ammunition. If you don't know what 50 caliber is, or 50 BMG, there's other actually 50 caliber ones, but it's a very large bullet. It's used in some of the longest range sniper rifles in the military. It's used in the M2 machine gun that's on top of tanks, and it's really, the rifles for them are extremely expensive. There's also a pistol version of the 50 cal used in like the Desert Eagle, other really large handguns. And then, of course, the banning of high-capacity magazines, defined as over 10 rounds. So on its face, you might see some of those requirements and think, well, that sounds understandable, talking about some of the stats with the mental health issues, with the 14,000 people that are murdered. Some of those might be a good thing. Here's why I think this bill is terrible. The fee for the license and insurance requirement is $800 per year. Now, I want you to stop and think, if you have $800 per year for something that you already have, because there is no grandfather clause in the bill as written. There is no grandfather clause. So absolutely everybody that owns a firearm would be required to pay $800 every year to continue keeping their firearm, or, according to this bill, their ammunition. Not only is it $800 per year if your significant other also would like a firearm, or if you would like to have her shoot it, she would also need to pay $800 per year for that license and insurance. I don't know about you, even those that are in the middle class, or what you might call middle class, lower middle class, they probably don't have $800 extra per year, certainly not right now in the middle of the pandemic. I'll talk a little bit about that more, but that's a lot of money. That is a lot of money. Additional things, they're talking about the psychiatric screenings. Those are also additional upfront money. If you want assault-style weapon, everyone in your family has to have the psychological screening, as well as any ex-wives you have, or ex-husbands. So now your ex-wife or ex-husband also has control over whether or not they think you should get a weapon. Now, I don't have an ex-wife, but many of you probably do, and a lot of times divorces don't go over well, and there's a lot of ill will, and it's very possible that somebody could screw you out of that just by saying something. Also, how easily do you think you could go and have them go see a psychologist to get cleared for this, or to talk to them and get screened by this, and get screened so that you could have a weapon? That might be a difficult ask. The training. So the regular firearms class also has a training requirement, which again is an additional cost. One time only. If you want a military style weapon, you have to have additional training with live fire training. Again, more of a cost. So I hope what you're seeing here is these costs really add up. And not only do they add up for the very beginning, they just continue on with this $800 per person per year. Another thing about this bill, you can be denied a weapon for really the way it's written. What they say is if you have a serious mental health, but they also say the psychologist can recommend you be denied for the weapon if you have any conditions mentioned under another paragraph. Really, you can be denied a weapon for absolutely any mental health condition at the discretion of the psychiatrist or psychologist. Any mental health condition. That means even minor depression. If you remember what we talked about before, 1 in 4 Americans will have some kind of diagnosable mental health condition. Now, the vast majority of them will not get seen and will not get diagnosed with it. But 1 in 4 Americans per year. And the way this is written is if you've ever had this, you might not be able to get a firearm. The intention of the bill, I believe, is only if you've been, and the way it's written is you can clearly see the intention is if you've been hospitalized for it. I don't know if you remember what I said before, but if you've been involuntarily hospitalized for it, you already aren't supposed to be able to own a weapon. There's also no clause in there where you could potentially get it back. So if you, let's say you self-reported and you went in and you said, hey, I don't think I'm mentally sound right now, I need some help, and you go in and you talk, they commit you to the hospital, you have lost, they can now deny you the ability to have a gun for the rest of your life, according to how this is written. That's quite significant. So if you've ever been in the hospital for any mental health issue, whether voluntary or involuntary, you will lose your right to firearms. You could potentially lose your right to firearms forever. It could be denied forever. And again, 1 in 4 Americans every year experiences something where they could be diagnosed. That's terrible. And I saw a lot of this, while well-intentioned, I saw a lot of things happen in the military around this where people would not get the help they needed because they were afraid of losing their weapon. So for my job, I was required to arm up every day that I went to my main job. With that, a lot of people were afraid to go for any type of counseling. And again, I was in the military back then. They were afraid to go to any type of counseling because they were afraid that they would pull their right to arm up or do weapons. They wouldn't be able to do their normal job, and then they get stuck on the cleaning squad and doing that, where they'd be doing nothing, they'd be useless, and then eventually processed out of the military. The truth of the matter was, if you self-reported and you had minor mental health issues, nothing would happen. You'd get the help you needed. But the perception that it could be taken away often meant people wouldn't go see, and they'd hammer it into your head that it's okay. And I'm reminding you that this is in the military, where people were deploying, where they would see things that nobody should see. You'd experience things like indirect fire attacks, things where you were scared for your life that really did mess up a lot of people. PTSD was a real thing. And people wouldn't go and get help for this for minor PTSD is what I'm talking about here, because they were afraid they would get their weapons taken away. They were afraid to be used against them. And minor PTSD, you're very functional. You can absolutely, me personally, I don't see any reason why a weapon shouldn't be taken away from you permanently. It doesn't necessarily make you suicidal. It doesn't make you a threat to others. There's nothing about that, but there is minor PTSD. You do need to get it taken care of. If you try to suppress it, it can often become worse than it is. And I saw this a lot in the military. And this is why I think this is a really bad idea. You're adding these, like any mental health conditions can make you ineligible to have a firearm. What this is going to be is people with firearms will not want to go get any help because they know that they could lose their firearm and potentially forever. Whether or not that's how it's written or that's how it's enforced, they know that it could potentially be that. They know that's a risk, and they will not go and get their help. Already, mental health has a bad stigma where a lot of people don't even believe it's a real thing. A lot of people feel they're judged for mental health, like they're seen as weaker. And it's really hard to get people in and get their mental health taken care of. If you add something like this to it, it's just going to be that much harder for people with weapons to go get the help they need. And what ultimately happens is those mental health conditions get worse. And that's the last thing we need is people with serious mental health issues and weapons. So I really think, while perhaps good intentioned, that's going to have really bad effects. Another thing that I just think is absolutely terrible is the registry, according to this, of all firearms and where they're stored would be open to the public. That means your neighbor or absolutely anybody could look you up and see not only what weapons you own, the weapons and ammunition you own, but also where it's stored, according to this bill. Couple things here. One, if you're a criminal and you want to rob a house, you could absolutely do some research and figure out who lives there. It's not that hard. A lot of times the ownership for houses is public record. There's a million ways you can find out who lives there. You could look it up and you could see, one, do they have any weapons? Two, is it in a place that might be accessible? And three, where's the first place you should go? One of the surveys that I saw before was that 60% of convicted felons admitted that they would not attack somebody if they knew they were armed or thought they might be. So they're going to be able to look up and see if you're not a firearm owner, they know you're not a firearm. Another thing is some people do have a lot of firearms. Firearms are valuable. They could look up and see you have a lot of firearms, scout out for your house, wait till you leave, and then go and work to steal your firearms, which could be used in a crime. I know this might seem a little conspiratorial, a little far out there, but it's really not that hard to imagine that if you have this type of information available, that somebody that's a criminal could take advantage of it. And this isn't counting the fact that already some people, not a lot, but some people view people with weapons as deranged, and they could absolutely look it up. And you see people that are conservative with weapons get doxxed. You see all kinds of things where they could pressure you or try to use that against you. And I don't want that information to be publicly accessible for everyone. So that's another reason why I think this is a terrible bill. And moving on to what I think is also other than the $800 per year fee, this is the most egregious part, is the minimum sentence for not notifying the AG when you loan your gun to somebody is 10 years. That's the minimum sentence. The minimum sentence for having a firearm without a license is 15 years. Both of these minimum sentences are greater than the average sentence for committing rape. So the average sentence for committing rape is 9.8 years with less than 5 served. Your minimum sentence, because you loaned your firearm to somebody else, is greater than committing a violent felony. And I believe the minimum was 15 and the maximum was 25 years. That's equal to murder in most states. So here, if you loan your gun to somebody, or you fail to renew your license, you still own the firearm or ammunition. The way this bill is written, ammunition would count as well. So let's say you did decide $800 a year is too much and you got rid of it, but you left your shotgun shell in your house and somebody reported you or somebody planted it on you. Again, not to get too conspiratorial, but let's say you left a box of ammo in your house. You could get 15 to 25 years in prison for the shotgun shell. To me, that's just beyond crazy. The fact that you would get longer as a minimum sentence than somebody who committed a violent, terrible crime is just, it's horrible. Some more, and another reason why I think this bill is also, while perhaps well-intentioned, is terrible. This bill effectively removes all firearms from the poor and middle class. So going back to the intro, when the person said, no one is trying to take your guns. They never have. Well, actually, how many poor people can afford $800 per year for the firearm? I'm going to say probably very few. How many of them can afford the training requirements? How many of them can afford the psychological exams? How many of them can take off work to get all of this? Probably not many. And then when you look at the other facts that one of the medicine journals did, and this is what they found is neighborhoods in neighborhood residents where they're in poverty, they were associated with a 27% higher rate of gun homicides, meaning they're the victims. So poor people are the victims more. Another one, Americans earning the lowest incomes, in this case less than $10,000 per household, experienced rates of violent victimhood that were 206% higher than people with the highest incomes. In that case, they put $75,000 or more per household. That was according to the Heartland Alliance program. It was in 2017, so it's a bit older. And that same study also said poverty and violence often intersect. They feed one another and share root causes. So really what I'm saying here is the people that might want a firearm to protect themselves are the people that are most likely to get murdered, are most likely to have violent crimes committed against them, and yet they're the ones that now cannot afford to have the firearm if they want it. So really, I think that's just a terrible policy. And when you talk about no one is coming for your guns, absolutely, yes, they are. You will not be able to afford a gun unless you are above middle class, or maybe if you are middle class, you can make a lot of sacrifices and have a right to have any gun. That license requirement is for any gun. There are additional license requirements for the military staff. Another thing that this bill would do is, unless edited, and this hasn't made it through the committees and all of that, so I'm sure it would change and morph should it come into law, but as written, it would completely eliminate subsistence hunting. Subsistence hunting are people that hunt to live. This is still very common in Alaska. This is often for indigenous people, not always, but it is still common in some states. That would be unaffordable for them. $800 plus the registration. It would also just make hunting unaffordable for most likely me. I'm in middle class, I would say. I haven't looked at the exact numbers for middle class, but I don't know that I can afford $800 per year. I have a lot of other bills. I have a lot of things I do. I am a hunter. I hunt on occasion, but I don't know if I would be able to hunt anymore. The types of people that would be able to hunt would be the kinds that more Americans think shouldn't, would be the trophy hunters. You know, you picture those people that are going on their African safaris and shooting the elephant because they want the elephant. That's not very well supported by the American people, but 80% of Americans support the right for legal hunting, and the number normally goes up if you're talking about hunting for food. So the vast majority of Americans support your ability to hunt. But if you're charging people $800 a year just to have the firearms license, now there are other hunting license requirements, there are tag requirements for animals, there are a lot of other requirements. Most hunters don't mind the other requirements because one, they're fairly affordable, and two, they go directly into conservation. That money for hunting goes directly into conservation efforts. So really those are the big things about why I think HB, House Bill 127 is just a bad bill. You can tell it's written by somebody that I don't think has a lot of knowledge about guns. I don't think they have a lot of knowledge about the common person and what they can afford. If you're talking about $800 a year plus a psychological exam, plus training requirements, your first year you're looking at easy well over $1,000 most likely for one person, and then $800 reoccurring. That is a lot of money. And then to meet the safe storage requirements, you're likely to have to buy other stuff, although I would always recommend people to buy things for safe storage. So it is important to lock up your guns and to keep them out of reach of children or people that shouldn't have them. So after talking about that, after giving a little bit of facts, hopefully you can understand how reasonable people could think that gun control is necessary. And you can understand that reasonable people could also think that there are a lot of benefits to firearms and that they could potentially have a net positive effect. I'm not saying you have to agree on that. One thing I didn't go into at all is the Second Amendment of the Constitution and the fact that it guarantees the right for people to keep and bear arms. There's a lot of different sides that want to interpret that differently, so I didn't go too much into that. I'm not going to go too far into registration arguments. Those are all arguments that people can have, and you can look at the evidence for that. But what I did want to do is give some tips to both sides when talking about gun reform with each other. The first one I have for those people that are anti-gun is, first, just learn a bit of language on the other side. If you can just picture someone coming in and talking to you or telling you what you should and should not be able to do with one of your hobbies, and they don't even understand the basics, or they really don't understand anything about it. Let's say they come in and give you advice about how to do your job, and you can tell that they have absolutely no idea what they're talking about. Think of what that sounds like to you. So if you're coming in and you want to have a topic or you want to have a conversation with somebody else, I would encourage you not to say things like what the author of this bill once said, is that they unfortunately held an AR-15 and it was as heavy as 2 fully loaded moving boxes. I paraphrase that a little bit. I don't have the exact quote. An AR-15 is about 7 pounds. That's not as heavy as 2 fully loaded moving boxes, unless your boxes are about 3.5 pounds each. It's not that heavy. They're a little heavy, depending on what you compare it to. Again, 7, maybe 8 pounds, depending on the AR and the configuration. But when you start talking about things like that, all it comes across is that you're just using extreme language, or that you have no idea what you're talking about. When you talk about how the AR kicked like a mule and almost threw you back, again, you sound like somebody that hasn't taken the time to at least understand something before you're going to take it from somebody else. Because an AR-15, again, I was in the military, I shot them, they do not kick hard. They are one of the smaller calibers. Virtually nobody uses them for hunting because they're too small, other than hunting things like wild boar. They are not a large caliber rifle. They were designed by the military to wound and not kill. So moving on, again, just learn a little bit of the language. I'm not expecting you to be an expert. However, on the other side, for those that are pro-gun, don't jump onto people and get all wrapped up in terminology. When you hear somebody call a magazine a clip, because yes, they are different, just recognize that common vernacular uses those interchangeably. Don't use that to jump on them because they don't know the language. Don't get caught up in the terminology. Now, if you hear somebody calling something fully automatic or fully semi-automatic, something silly like that, absolutely take a little bit of time and help them to understand the difference. But don't get too wrapped up in that and say it as because they don't know the difference between a magazine and a clip. They can never have an intelligent conversation with you. That's just not true. You can't expect them to go to the level of detail and knowledge that you have. I was in the military. I was around my weapons. I have a few weapons myself. Nothing too crazy, but there's a lot of terminology I don't know. They can't know everything, so don't get wrapped up in that terminology. For the anti-gun people, understand that ultimately it's people that kill other people, and that the weapon is a tool. I understand that guns can be scary for some people, and I would encourage you to try not to get wrapped up in they're scary to me, or they're scary, or that type of weapon is scary, and to really let that scariness dictate how you feel about it. I would encourage you to discuss more of the facts and go into the good statistics that argue that gun control might work to the other person. Get them to acknowledge some common ground there. For the pro-gun side, going back to them, don't jump on we're trying to take away our guns, or you just want to take away our guns, or everyone's going to take away our guns. even though in some cases I kind of think that's true. I just said it. House bill effectively does take away all guns from the poor and middle class. But don't just jump on that with the common person unless it's what they really want. The vast majority of Americans support your right to own some type of weapon. So don't jump there. Uh, Also, I would avoid the pro gun people to jump on the kind of extreme language you use. The all gun laws are infringement. I do understand that the Second Amendment is the only thing in the Constitution that I'm aware of that says shall not be infringed. I understand you may have the view that all gun laws are infringement. I don't think that view is helpful in talking to the other side or winning the other side to your point. I would much rather you talk with statistics and different things. You can mention the Constitution and what it's for, but I'd rather you not argue for your right to own a tank or a nuclear weapon. So again, avoid expressing that extreme language if that's your view. Back to the anti-gun crowd there, or the people that are arguing for very strict gun regulation. Another thing along the lines of don't get caught up in the it's scary. Really try to separate the fear from the fact. One of the things I saw in this bill, the House Bill 127, also was a lot of it's a military weapon if it has these features. And you talk about these features that have absolutely no bearing on the performance of the weapon, how fast it would fire, how lethal it would be, or you use silly things like, one of the line items is if it has a grenade launcher. You can't buy and use a grenade launcher as a regular civilian. I do believe there's a very lengthy destructive weapons permitting process that certain people that have gun businesses can go through, but a regular person cannot just buy a grenade launcher. When you're talking about tactical features, one of them was like anything around the barrel so as not to get burned when you touch it, so a handguard. Why does whether or not you get burned when you hold it matter? So again, what they were doing is they're taking all of these things that look scary in the movies and they're trying to ban them. Or if you have, in this case, if you have more of those features, you have to have your special license and, you have to have your ex sit down and make sure that she's okay with you having the firearm. So don't get wrapped around in then that looks scary. I think of, you go to the gun store and to someone who hasn't been around guns, they see that AR and they say, that's scary. And sometimes I'll ask, why? Why is that scary? Well, the answer is, because that's what the school shooters use. And, okay, yes, I acknowledge that some school shooters have used that, not all of them. They are responsible for less than 4% of the deaths, and there are a lot more firearms out there that can cause equal destruction or more. What necessarily makes that scary? Again, the only thing that's making it scary is you're associating it with a certain type of person. And what happens is if you ban all of these weapons that you're associating with a certain type of person, they'll probably just go get one of the other types of weapons and start using that. And then that becomes the scary one, or that's the one you see in the movies. So again, try not to get too caught up in that's a scary weapon. Now, I'm not going to deny that an AR-15 can shoot faster than your 6-shooter, your revolver. But at the same time, an AR-15 can't really shoot faster. Actually, can't shoot faster than a lot of pistols. Because it really can shoot about the same. And I might actually take that 6-shooter back. If you haven't, feel free to look up Jerry Miculek, I believe is his name, a pro revolver shooter who can shoot a 6-shooter just about as fast as or faster than anyone shooting an AR. He can do it accurately and reload extremely fast for his revolver. So just understand that. Going back to the pro-gun, recognize that there is some research that gun control can affect some deaths. And I'm saying that in a very may and can. Just recognize that there is research out there for the other side. There is an argument for the other side. Don't just throw away everything. And again, that goes back to don't use that extreme language when discussing guns. You just come across a certain way. Another thing for the anti-gun people, a lot of people call for the universal background checks. A lot of people talk about the gun show loophole. Most of those things are political talking points that aren't really real. background checks are federally required when buying a firearm from any dealer. So anybody that's licensed to sell firearms. Again, as I'll say before, there are some states that allow private transactions. So that's a different story. If you want to argue for that, that's fine. But just recognize a lot of people think that you just go to Walmart. Some Walmarts do sell guns, and you can just grab a gun and walk out with it. It's not like that. Or you go to a gun show and you just say, hey, I'm going to go throw my money on the table and walk out. That's not the case. These people will make you fill out a form. That form will ask you if you're a felon, and lying under that is a punishable offense. They'll run you through the background check system, and they will see if you are a violent felon. That system is not perfect, and I think there are a lot of improvements that we could do to that system. But just recognize that background checks are required. I've known some pro-gun people that like to encourage someone to go get one. Go to a store and just say, hey, I'd like to go have a background check to see if I can purchase a firearm. Would you walk me through the process? Or can I see the form? And you'll see the form, and you'll see the different things where you have to verify you're not from this. They take that form, they submit it to the background check thing, and normally it only takes about 5 minutes or so, but it'll see, and it'll check to see if you have a criminal record, things like that. So just recognize that a lot of pro-gun people get upset when you start talking about these things that really you're like, this is already a law. This is already something. You're asking for something that's already a law. There are estimated about 200,000 laws in the U.S., taking into account all the different states with all the different laws. There are a lot of laws that do control firearms. Now, federally, there isn't a lot of consistency. Different states do have different laws. But do realize that some of those laws either aren't enforced well or have little effect. So, again, talking about some of the school shooters, one of them was dishonorably discharged from the military, shouldn't have had one. One of them had he was a violent felon, but that paperwork was not properly submitted into the system. I believe another one had a domestic assault charge that also wasn't in the system. I think that one was in the military, and they hadn't put over the information as well. All of those things should have prevented them from getting a firearm. Now, again, many people do legally get a gun and commit violence. I'm not trying to diminish that. Moving on to the pro-gun people. Sad that I have to remind you this, but there are a lot of negative stereotypes for people that like guns. I would ask that you try not to feed into those. Try not to be fast to anger. Try not to seem unreasonable. One of the things that, talking with a colleague once, we were talking about it, and I mentioned to him how I often don't tell people that I own a firearm because I don't want to be judged or I don't want to be crazy. And his response, which he's a very reasonable person, and his response was, well, I think a lot of people know that I'm not a crazy person. And so when they find out that I own a firearm and that I hunt, they realize that, oh, sane people do have firearms. And really what I'm saying here is the vast majority of firearm owners are sane. The vast majority of firearm owners just want it to protect themselves or to go hunting or to go sport shooting. The vast majority of firearm owners don't have fantasies about killing people. So just recognize that. And again, for those of you that are pro-gun, try not to feed into any of those stereotypes. Let's be reasonable when talking about it. And the same goes for the other side. If you're anti-gun, please don't assume those stereotypes. There's a stereotype of, all gun owners or hunters are not intelligent people that are psychopaths or something like that. Try to get to know them a little bit and realize that sane people can own firearms. They may hunt. Vast majority of hunters that I've met do so for food. They want to hunt the animals and they do it for food. They eat the animal rather than doing it for the joy of the kill, or they don't do it a lot of them don't do trophy hunting, meaning that they hunt only for the let's say the antlers, those beautiful antlers for the deer. They don't hunt only for that. Now, a lot of them do try to get an older deer, and they do like those large antlers because they want to harvest an animal that is mature, that's lived a long life, and they want one that has a lot of meat. So, again, don't assume stereotypes. I believe I got all of that. Those are kind of my rules for talking about the two. Is really, it's all about understanding that there are two sides to gun reform. And I would encourage you people to realize that there are statistics and research on both sides of varying degrees of confidence that you can have in their conclusions. And the most important rule is just focus on areas of commonality. Nobody, or most people, the vast majority of people, don't want people to die unnecessarily. Most people would rather suicides go down. People want to protect life. Just because you're pro-gun doesn't mean you don't care about the kids that are killed in school shootings. It doesn't mean you don't care about them. You may just have a different solution with how to take care of that issue. A lot of pro-gun people truly do believe that it's a mental health issue. And you see that in some of the stats I've talked about. Some people argue, and a lot of experts disagree, and they don't think it's necessarily just a mental health issue. But a lot of gun people do see it more as a mental health issue of people not getting the mental health help that they need, and so they're going and they're lashing out against people. And what they want to say is that, if it's not this tool, they'll find another tool. You can absolutely find other ways to destroy a lot of people or to kill a lot of people without a firearm. As I mentioned before, look up mass stabbings. That is a thing. Now, it's a lot harder to mass stab than to mass shoot, I would imagine. You can also look at some of the bombings that have happened. There are a lot of ways, and really what they argue is it's a mental health issue. But really what I want you to do is to focus on that commonality. You do both want to protect life. One person might think that they can protect life by the defensive uses of the guns. You might think that you can protect life by lowering the number of guns and lowering the success rates of the suicides when they happen. And both of you can be reasonable. And that's what I really want to get across with this podcast. I'm really hoping that this at least took, if you're one side or the other, or if you're on the fence, that you at least were able to take some of these facts and just take some of this conversation and really try to understand that there is two sides to gun control, and to understand maybe how to talk to the other side about gun control, whether you're for it or against it. And again, I would encourage both sides to not fall into the stereotypes and don't jump to conclusions when talking about it. Anyway, I appreciate you taking the time to listen to this fairly heavy podcast. Have a great day, and I will talk to you next week.